Sarah Chun sat in the back row of the music classroom, trying to make herself invisible. She watched her fingers drum nervously on the desk as Mrs. Rodriguez talked about the spring recital. Every year, students from the music program performed for their families and friends. It was supposed to be fun and exciting. For Sarah, it felt like her worst nightmare. She looked around at the other students in her piano class. They all seemed so confident and eager. Jessica raised her hand high in the air, practically bouncing in her seat. "Can I play the Moonlight Sonata?" she asked. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled and nodded. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The Moonlight Sonata was one of the hardest pieces she had ever heard. Tommy, who sat 2 seats in front of her, was already talking about a Chopin piece he wanted to try. "My older sister played it last year," he said proudly. She got a standing ovation. Sarah sank lower in her chair. She had been taking piano lessons for only 2 years. Most of these kids had been playing since they were little. Sarah remembered when she first started taking piano lessons. She was 14 years old, which felt very late compared to everyone else. Her younger brother Jake had started when he was 6. He was now 12 and could already play pieces that made Sarah's head spin. Sometimes she would listen to him practice from her room upstairs. His fingers moved so fast across the keys. The music sounded like it was flowing out of him naturally. Her own playing was nothing like that. When Sarah sat at the piano, she had to think about every single note. She would count the beats carefully and watch her fingers to make sure they hit the right keys. Even simple songs took her weeks to learn. Jake could learn the same songs in just a few days. "Sarah, what about you?" Mrs. Rodriguez's voice broke through her thoughts. "Have you thought about what you might like to play for the recital?" All eyes turned to look at her. Sarah felt her face turn red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she possibly play? She was still working on basic scales. Last week, she had finally managed to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" with both hands at the same time. That hardly seemed like recital material. I'm not sure I'm ready for the recital," Sarah said quietly. Her voice was so soft that Mrs. Rodriguez had to lean forward to hear her. "Nonsense," Mrs. Rodriguez said with a warm smile. "Everyone in this class is ready to perform something. We'll find the perfect piece for you." After class, Sarah walked slowly to her locker. She could hear the other students chatting excitedly about their recital pieces. Some were already discussing what they would wear and who they would invite. Sarah just wanted to disappear. At home that evening, Sarah sat at the family piano in the living room. It was an old upright piano that her parents had bought when Jake started taking lessons. The keys were a little yellow with age, and some of them stuck when you pressed them. But it made beautiful music when Jake played it. Sarah opened her beginner piano book and started working on her current assignment. It was a simple melody with basic chords. She played it slowly, counting each beat out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her left hand played simple bass notes while her right hand picked out the melody. "That sounds nice," her mom said, poking her head into the living room. Sarah stopped playing immediately. "It's just a beginner song," Sarah mumbled. "Nothing special." "I think it's lovely," her mom said. "Are you going to play in the recital this year?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. I'm not good enough." Her mom sat down on the bench next to her. I remember when Jake was nervous about his first recital, too. He was so worried about making mistakes." "But Jake is naturally talented," Sarah said. "He's always been good at music. I'm just ... Talent is important," her mom agreed. "But practice and heart matter more. I can hear how much you care about the music when you play, even these simple songs." Sarah wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated her mom trying to make her feel better. Later that night, Sarah lay in her bed thinking about the recital. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jake practicing in the living room. He was working on a complex classical piece that sounded impossibly difficult. The notes seemed to dance and flow together in perfect harmony. Sarah listened until he finished, then pulled her pillow over her head. The next day at school, Sarah tried to avoid the music classroom, but she had to walk past it to get to her next class. Through the open door, she could see some students staying after class to practice. Jessica was at the piano, her fingers flying across the keys as she played part of her Moonlight Sonata. Even though she was still learning it, it already sounded amazing. Sarah hurried past before anyone could see her watching. During lunch, she sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria. She usually sat with a few friends from her math class, but today she needed to be alone with her thoughts. She pulled out her notebook and started writing down all the reasons why she shouldn't be in the recital. Too new to piano, she wrote. Not talented enough. Will embarrass myself. Will embarrass Mrs. Rodriguez. Everyone will know I don't belong. The list grew longer and longer. By the time lunch was over, she had filled an entire page. That afternoon in piano class, Mrs. Rodriguez announced that students needed to choose their recital pieces by Friday. That gave everyone 3 days to decide. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. 3 days to choose something she could actually play without making a fool of herself. She thought about talking to her parents about dropping out of the recital altogether. Maybe she could say she was sick that day, or maybe she could volunteer to help with something backstage instead of performing, but deep down, Sarah knew that wasn't really what she wanted. Despite all her fears and doubts, there was a small part of her that wanted to be up on that stage. She wanted to share music with an audience, even if it was just a simple song. She wanted to feel like a real musician, even for just a few minutes. The problem was, she had no idea what she could possibly play that wouldn't show everyone just how far behind she was compared to the other students. As she walked home from school that day, Sarah made a decision. She would talk to Mrs. Rodriguez after class tomorrow. Maybe her teacher would have an idea for a piece that was simple enough for her to learn, but impressive enough that she wouldn't completely embarrass herself. It was a small step, but it felt like the bravest thing Sarah had ever done. The next day, Sarah's hands were sweating as she waited for piano class to end. She had practiced what she wanted to say to Mrs. Rodriguez at least 20 times in her head. But now that the moment was here, all her carefully planned words seemed to have disappeared. All right, everyone, that's all for today, Mrs. Rodriguez said as the bell rang. Remember, recital pieces need to be chosen by Friday. The other students packed up their books and headed for the door, chatting about their song choices. Sarah stayed in her seat, pretending to organize her music folder. When the last student left, she took a deep breath and walked up to her teacher's desk. Mrs. Rodriguez? Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. Yes, Sarah, what can I do for you? Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from the papers she was grading and gave Sarah her full attention. I was wondering if you could help me pick a piece for the recital. I don't really know what I should play. Sarah felt her cheeks getting warm. I'm not as advanced as the other students. Mrs. Rodriguez set down her pen and smiled kindly. I'm so glad you came to talk to me about this. I've been thinking about the perfect piece for you, actually. Sarah blinked in surprise. Her teacher had been thinking about her? Really? Really? Mrs. Rodriguez stood up and walked over to a tall filing cabinet in the corner of the classroom. She opened one of the drawers and pulled out a folder full of sheet music. I have something very special in mind. Sarah watched nervously as her teacher flipped through the pages. What if the piece was still too hard for her? What if Mrs. Rodriguez didn't really understand how limited her skills were? Here it is. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled out a single sheet of music and placed it on the piano. This is what I think you should play. Sarah looked down at the page. At the top, in elegant letters, it said, Für Elise by Ludwig van Beethoven. Sarah's heart sank. She knew this piece. She had heard it many times before. It was beautiful and famous, but it was also complicated. Way too complicated for someone like her, Mrs. Rodriguez. I don't think I can play this, Sarah said quickly. This is way too hard for me. I've heard this piece before, and it's really difficult. Mrs. Rodriguez held up her hand gently. Look more carefully at the music, Sarah. Sarah looked down at the page again. This time she noticed something different. The music looked simpler than she remembered. There weren't as many notes packed together. The rhythms looked more basic. At the bottom of the page in small print it said, Simplified arrangement for beginning students. This is a special version of Für Elise, Mrs. Rodriguez explained. It keeps all the beauty of the original piece, but it's written for students who are still developing their skills. The melody is exactly the same, but the accompaniment is simplified. Sarah studied the music more carefully. The right-hand part did look manageable. It was mostly single notes, playing the famous melody that everyone knew and loved. The left-hand part was simple too, mostly basic chords and single bass notes. Nothing too complicated or fast? But won't everyone know it's the easy version? Sarah asked. She was grateful that Mrs. Rodriguez had found something she might actually be able to play, but she was also worried about being judged. Sarah, let me tell you something important, Mrs. Rodriguez said, sitting down on the piano bench. Music isn't about showing off how difficult a piece is. It's about sharing something beautiful with other people. This arrangement of Für Elise is just as valid and just as beautiful as any other version. Sarah wasn't completely convinced, but she nodded anyway. Besides, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, most people in the audience won't even know it's a simplified version. They'll just hear the gorgeous melody that Beethoven wrote over 200 years ago, and if they do realize it's an easier arrangement, so what? You're a student. You're learning. That's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Mrs. Rodriguez played through the piece slowly so Sarah could hear how it sounded. The melody was indeed beautiful. It started gently and peacefully, then had moments of drama and excitement before ending softly again. Even in its simplified form, it told a complete musical story. What do you think? Mrs. Rodriguez asked when she finished playing. Sarah stared at the music. Part of her was excited. This was a real piece by a famous composer. It was something people would recognize and appreciate, but another part of her was still worried. It's beautiful, Sarah said honestly, but what if I mess it up? What if I make mistakes during the performance? Everyone makes mistakes, Sarah, even professional musicians. The important thing is to keep going and to put your heart into the music. Mrs. Rodriguez handed her the sheet music. Take this home and try it out. Don't worry about getting it perfect right away. Just see how it feels. Sarah took the music with shaky hands. How long do I have to learn it? The recital is in 6 weeks. That's plenty of time to learn this piece well, especially if you practice regularly. 6 weeks. That sounded like both a very long time and no time at all. I'll try my best, Sarah said. I know you will, and Sarah, I want you to know that I chose this piece specifically for you because I believe you can do it justice. I've heard you play in class. You have something special, even if you don't see it yourself yet. Sarah felt a warm glow in her chest. Mrs. Rodriguez believed in her. That had to count for something. That evening at home, Sarah sat at the family piano with her new piece of music. She placed it carefully on the music stand and studied it for a few minutes before trying to play anything. The notes didn't look too scary when she examined them closely. She started by playing just the right-hand part, very slowly. The melody was indeed the famous Für Elise that she had heard so many times before. Even played slowly and simply, it was recognizable and beautiful. Note by note, she worked through the first line of music, then she tried the left-hand part by itself. Simple chords and bass notes, just like Mrs. Rodriguez had said. Nothing too complicated, but they provided a nice foundation for the melody. What are you working on? Jake asked, appearing in the doorway. It's a piece for the recital, Sarah said, not wanting to admit it was a simplified version. Für Elise, cool, that's a classic, can I hear it? Sarah's stomach tightened. It's still really rough, I just got it today. That's okay, I just want to hear how it sounds. Reluctantly, Sarah played through the first few measures with both hands together. It was slow and hesitant, but the basic shape of the piece was there. That sounds really nice, Jake said, and Sarah could tell he meant it. I like that piece. It's got a great melody. Thanks, Sarah said, feeling a little better. Are you nervous about the recital? Jake asked. Sarah nodded. Terrified, actually. I remember my first recital, Jake said. I was so scared I almost threw up. But once I started playing, it was actually kind of fun. There's something cool about sharing music with people. After Jake left, Sarah continued practicing. She worked through the piece measure by measure, slowly building up her familiarity with it. By the end of the evening, she could play through the first half of the piece without too many mistakes. Maybe this was actually possible. Maybe she really could do this. Over the next few days, Sarah carried the sheet music with her everywhere. She studied it during lunch, hummed the melody while walking between classes, and even visualized playing it while lying in bed at night. Each day, her practice sessions got a little bit easier. The notes became more familiar under her fingers. She started to memorize some sections without even trying. And slowly, very slowly, she began to believe that she might actually be able to pull this off. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that everyone would see right through her simplified arrangement. Would the other students think she was taking the easy way out? Would the audience be disappointed when they realized she wasn't playing the full, difficult version? These worries followed her through her practice sessions, making her doubt herself. Even when she was playing well, she wanted to do justice to Mrs. Rodriguez's faith in her, but she wasn't sure she was brave enough to get up on that stage and show everyone exactly how much of a beginner she really was. 2 weeks into practicing for Elise, Sarah was starting to feel more confident about the notes themselves. She could play through most of the piece without stopping, and her fingers were getting used to the patterns. But her confidence in herself as a performer was getting worse every day. That started on a Tuesday morning when she overheard a conversation in the hallway before first period. Jessica and 2 other girls from piano class were talking about their recital pieces. "I'm doing the first movement of Moonlight Sonata," Jessica said proudly. "My private teacher says it's pretty advanced for someone my age." "That's so cool," said Emma. "I'm doing a Chopin waltz. It has this really tricky part where both hands have to play really fast scales at the same time." "What about Sarah?" asked the third girl, whose name was Lisa. "Has anyone heard what she's playing?" Sarah pressed herself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't see her. "I heard she's doing Für Elise," Jessica said, "but I think it must be the easy version. The one they give to little kids." The girls laughed, and Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment. "That's what my little sister plays," Emma added. "She learned it when she was 8. Sarah waited until they walked away before she moved from her hiding spot. She spent the rest of the day feeling terrible about herself and her piece choice. Maybe she should ask Mrs. Rodriguez for something different, something that wouldn't make her look like a little kid. But when she got to piano class that afternoon, she couldn't bring herself to say anything. Mrs. Rodriguez asked how her practice was going, and Sarah just nodded and said, "Fine," even though she was feeling anything but fine. After school, Sarah went to the practice room in the music wing. It was a small room with an old upright piano and no windows. She often came here to practice when she didn't want anyone to hear her mistakes. Today, she needed the privacy more than ever. She pulled out her sheet music and started playing through Für Elise, but now, instead of hearing the beautiful melody that had excited her 2 weeks ago, all she could hear was how simple and basic it sounded. The left-hand part was so easy that she barely had to think about it. The right-hand melody, while pretty, didn't have any of the flashy runs or dramatic flourishes that the other students' pieces had. "This is stupid," she said out loud to the empty room. "I sound like a beginner." She tried playing it faster, thinking that might make it sound more impressive. But when she did that, she started making mistakes. The faster tempo made her nervous, and her fingers stumbled over notes that she could play perfectly at a slower speed. She tried adding some extra notes here and there, thinking maybe she could jazz it up a little. But that just made it sound messy and wrong. The simple beauty of the original arrangement was lost. Frustrated, Sarah slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a harsh, discordant sound. She put her head in her hands and felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "Why did I ever think I could do this?" she whispered. The next few days were even worse. Every time Sarah heard one of her classmates practicing their recital pieces, she felt more and more inadequate. Tommy's Chopin piece sounded like something you would hear at a real concert. Lisa had chosen a batch invention that was so complex. It made Sarah's head spin just listening to it. And then there was Marcus, who was only a year older than Sarah, but had been playing piano since he was 4. His recital piece was a Rachmaninoff prelude that sounded impossibly difficult and beautiful. When Sarah heard him practicing it during lunch one day, she almost cried right there in the hallway. At home, her practice sessions became tense and frustrating. She would sit down at the piano with determination, but within a few minutes she would be filled with doubt and discouragement. Her playing became mechanical and lifeless. She was just going through the motions, hitting the right notes but not really making music. Jake noticed the change. One evening, after listening to her practice for about 10 minutes, he came into the living room. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You sound kind of angry when you play." Sarah stopped playing and turned to look at him. "I'm fine. You don't sound fine. You used to play that piece really prettily. Now it sounds like you're mad at it." Sarah sighed. "It's just ... It's too easy. Everyone else is playing these amazing, complicated pieces, and I'm playing something that 8-year-olds can play." Jake sat down on the couch. So it's embarrassing. I'm going to get up on that stage and everyone is going to know that I'm not a real pianist? They're going to know that I don't belong there. But you are a real pianist, Jake said. You practice every day. You care about music. You're learning and getting better. That makes you a real pianist. Not like you, Sarah said. Not like the other kids in my class. Sarah, can I tell you something? Jake's voice was serious. When I was first starting out, I was so worried about what other people thought that I almost quit taking lessons. Sarah looked at him in surprise. Really? But you're so good. I wasn't always good. And I'm still not perfect. Last month, I completely messed up a piece during my lesson because I was so worried about making it sound impressive instead of just making it sound good. Jake walked over to the piano and sat down next to Sarah on the bench. Can you play your piece for me again? But this time, don't think about whether it's easy or hard. Just think about the music itself. Sarah hesitated, then put her hands back on the keys. She tried to push all her worries out of her mind and just focus on the notes. She played through the first section of Für Elise, trying to hear it the way she had when Mrs. Rodriguez first played it for her. The melody was indeed beautiful. It started gently, like someone quietly telling a story. Then it grew a little more dramatic, like the story was getting exciting. Then it settled back down into something peaceful and thoughtful. That was really nice, Jake said when she finished. I could hear you actually listening to what you were playing that time. Thanks, Sarah said, feeling a little better. You know what I think? Jake continued. I think you're worried about the wrong thing. You're worried about impressing people with how hard your piece is. But the best performances aren't the ones that show off how difficult something is. They're the ones that make people feel something. Over the next week, Sarah tried to take Jake's advice to heart. Instead of focusing on how simple her piece was compared to everyone else's, she tried to focus on what story she wanted to tell with her music. She started paying attention to the dynamics more carefully. Some parts of the piece should be played softly and gently. Other parts should be stronger and more confident. She worked on making smooth connections between the phrases, so the melody would flow like a conversation. She also started thinking about the emotional content of the piece. What was Beethoven trying to express when he wrote this music? What feelings did it bring up in her when she played it? Gradually, her practice sessions became more interesting and satisfying. She was still playing the same simple arrangement, but she was finding ways to make it more expressive and personal. But even as her playing improved, her anxiety about the performance itself continued to grow. She would lie awake at night, imagining all the ways things could go wrong. What if she forgot the music in the middle of the piece? What if her hands shook so badly that she couldn't hit the right notes? What if she froze up completely and couldn't play anything at all? 3 weeks before the recital, Mrs. Rodriguez announced that students would start having practice performances in class. Each week, a few students would play their pieces for the rest of the class so they could get used to performing in front of an audience. Sarah's stomach dropped when she heard this announcement. Playing for her family at home was one thing, Playing for her classmates, who would all know exactly how much easier her piece was than theirs, was something else entirely. She spent the rest of that class period trying to figure out how to get out of the practice performance. Maybe she could fake being sick that day. Maybe she could say she wasn't ready yet and needed more time. But deep down, she knew that avoiding the practice performance would just make the real recital even more terrifying. She was going to have to face her fears sooner or later. The question was whether she would be brave enough to do it, or whether she would find an excuse to back out of the recital altogether. 3 days before the recital, Sarah found herself alone in the school auditorium after hours. She had stayed late to help Mrs. Rodriguez organize music folders for the performance, and when they finished, her teacher had to rush to a meeting. Sarah was left alone with the grand piano on the empty stage. She had never played on this piano before. During regular classes, they used the upright pianos in the music classroom. The grand piano was reserved for special performances and important events. It looked beautiful and intimidating under the stage lights. Sarah walked slowly up the steps to the stage. Her footsteps echoed in the empty auditorium. Rows and rows of seats stretched out in front of her, all empty now but soon to be filled with parents, teachers, and fellow students for the recital. She sat down at the piano bench and lifted the lid covering the keys. The keys were bright white and looked like they had been polished recently. She pressed middle C gently, and the sound that came out was richer and more resonant than anything she had ever heard from a piano before. Sarah pulled her sheet music out of her backpack. She had been carrying it with her everywhere for weeks now, and the pages were starting to look worn from all the handling. She placed it on the music stand and adjusted the bench to the right height. She began playing Fur-Elise the way she always did, slowly and carefully. But something was different. The sound coming from this piano was so much more beautiful than what she was used to. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer, and the resonance filled the entire auditorium. As she played, Sarah started to relax. There was no one here to judge her or compare her to anyone else. It was just her and the music and this incredible instrument. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't thinking about whether her piece was too easy or whether she was good enough halfway. Through the piece, something unexpected happened. As she played the familiar melody with her right hand, her left hand started doing something different. Instead of just playing the simple chords written in her sheet music, she found herself adding extra notes. Her pinky finger reached down to play deeper bass notes that weren't written anywhere on the page. Sarah stopped playing and looked down at her hands in surprise. Where had those extra notes come from? She looked at her sheet music to make sure she hadn't been reading it wrong, but no. The left-hand part was exactly as simple as it had always been. She started the section again, and the same thing happened. Her left hand seemed to have a mind of its own, adding harmonies and bass lines that made the music sound fuller and more complex. But these weren't random notes. They fit perfectly with the melody and made the whole piece sound more complete. Sarah had no idea where this was coming from. She had never learned these extra parts. Mrs. Rodriguez had never shown them to her. But somehow, her ear was telling her what notes would sound good, and her fingers were finding them on the keys. She continued playing, and more unexpected things started happening. Her right hand began adding small decorations to the melody. Nothing fancy or showy, just little flourishes that made the simple tune more interesting. Her tempo started changing too, slowing down in some places for dramatic effect and speeding up slightly in others to create excitement. Most surprising of all, her dynamics began changing naturally. She found herself playing some phrases very softly so that the sound barely filled the auditorium. Other phrases she played with more strength and confidence, letting the beautiful tone of the grand piano ring out fully. Sarah had never played like this before. For weeks, she had been focused on just hitting the right notes at the right time. She had been so worried about making mistakes that she hadn't been thinking about the music itself. But now, alone on this stage with no one listening, she was discovering that she had musical instincts she didn't even know existed. She played through the entire piece this way, letting her hands and her ear guide her instead of just following the notes on the page exactly. When she finished, she sat in silence for a moment, amazed at what had just happened. That was beautiful. Sarah spun around, startled. Mrs. Rodriguez was standing at the back of the auditorium. Sarah hadn't heard her come in. "Mrs. Rodriguez! I didn't know you were there. I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't be using the grand piano without permission." "Don't apologize," Mrs. Rodriguez said, walking down the aisle toward the stage. "That was absolutely wonderful. I've never heard you play like that before." Sarah felt embarrassed. "I was just messing around. I know I was playing notes that aren't in the music." "Sarah, what you just did was not messing around. That was real musicianship." Mrs. Rodriguez climbed the steps to the stage. "You were making the music your own. You were interpreting it, not just playing it. But I changed things. I added notes that Beethoven didn't write." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "Beethoven would have loved what you just did." Musicians have been interpreting and embellishing his music for over 200 years. What matters is that your additions serve the music. They made it more expressive, more personal. She sat down next to Sarah on the piano bench. "Can you do that again? Play it the way you just played it?" Sarah wasn't sure she could. It had felt so natural and spontaneous. But she put her hands back on the keys and tried to recreate what had happened. This time she was more conscious of what she was doing, but the musical instincts were still there. Her left hand found those deeper bass notes again. Her right hand added the same small decorations. The dynamics and tempo changes felt right and natural. "How are you doing this?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked when Sarah finished. "Where did you learn to play those extra parts?" "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I never learned them anywhere. They just right." "This is exactly what I was hoping would happen," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "I chose that simplified arrangement for you not because I thought you couldn't handle anything more difficult, but because I thought it would give you space to add your own musical ideas. Simple music can be a canvas for creativity, but only if the musician is brave enough to trust their own instincts." Sarah looked down at her hands. "Do you really think it sounds good? I'm not just making it worse?" "Sarah, what you just played was more musical than anything I've heard from you before. It was also more musical than most of what I'll hear at the recital. Technical difficulty doesn't matter if there's no soul behind it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the echoes of the music still hanging in the air. "The question is," Mrs. Rodriguez continued, "do you have the courage to play it this way at the recital? It means trusting yourself and your musical instincts, even when you're nervous." Sarah thought about this. Playing this way felt wonderful, but it also felt risky. What if she tried to add these embellishments during the recital and made mistakes? What if her nerves made her forget all the musical ideas that had come so naturally? "Today, what if I mess up?" Sarah asked. "Then you mess up," Mrs. Rodriguez said simply. "But I'd rather hear you mess up while trying to make real music than hear you play perfectly without any soul." Music isn't about perfection, Sarah. It's about communication. It's about sharing something that comes from inside you. Sarah played through the piece one more time, trying to memorize not just the notes but the feeling of playing this way. She wanted to remember how it felt to trust her musical instincts, to let the music guide her hands instead of forcing her hands to follow. The page exactly when she finished, Mrs. Rodriguez stood up. "I have to go home now, but I want you to know something. What you just discovered about yourself as a musician is more valuable than years of technical training. Don't lose this feeling before the recital." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Sarah stayed at the piano for another 30 minutes, practicing her new way of playing the piece. Each time through, she discovered something new, a different way to phrase a melody, a new place where a softer dynamic would be more effective, a small rhythmic change that made the music more expressive. For the first time since she had chosen her recital piece, Sarah was excited about the performance instead of just nervous. She had found her own voice in the music, and it felt amazing, but as she walked home that evening, the doubts started creeping back in. Playing alone in an empty auditorium was one thing. Playing in front of a crowd of people was something completely different. Would she be able to trust her instincts when she was nervous? Would she remember this feeling of musical freedom when she was sitting on that stage with hundreds of eyes watching her? The recital was only 3 days away. Sarah had just discovered that she had musical abilities she never knew existed. The question was whether she would be brave enough to use them when it really mattered. The day of the recital arrived gray and rainy. Sarah woke up with her stomach already in knots. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing between excitement about what she had discovered during her practice sessions and terror about performing in front of an audience. She spent the morning trying to eat breakfast, but everything tasted like cardboard. Her mom made her favorite pancakes, but Sarah could only manage a few bites before pushing the plate away. "You need to eat something," her mom said gently. "You'll need energy for tonight." "I can't," Sarah said. "I feel too nervous." Jake looked up from his own breakfast. "Do you want to run through your piece one more time before we leave?" Sarah shook her head. "I've practiced it 100 times this week. If I don't know it by now, I never will." The truth was, she was afraid to practice anymore. Ever since her discovery in the auditorium 3 days ago, her practice sessions had been different. Sometimes she could capture that same magical feeling, playing with all the musical instincts and embellishments that had surprised her so much. Other times, her nerves would take over and she would fall back into the old pattern of just playing the notes exactly as written. She didn't know which version would come out during the actual performance, and that uncertainty was making her even more anxious. The recital was 7 o'clock that evening. Students were supposed to arrive at 6 for a final rehearsal and sound check. Sarah spent the afternoon trying to distract herself with homework and television, but nothing could take her mind off what was coming. At 5:30, her family loaded into the car to drive to school. Sarah sat in the back seat, clutching her sheet music even though she had memorized the piece weeks ago. Having the physical pages with her felt like a security blanket. "Are you excited?" her dad asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Terrified," Sarah answered honestly. "That's normal," her mom said. "Even professional musicians get nervous before they perform." When they arrived at the school, the parking lot was already filling up with cars. Sarah could see other students walking toward the building, some carrying instrument cases, others holding flowers that their families had brought for them. Sarah and her family went to the auditorium first so she could check in with Mrs. Rodriguez. The space looked completely different than it had when Sarah was there alone 3 days ago. The stage was set up with a microphone stand and a spotlight. The curtains were drawn and the audience area was buzzing with activity as people found their seats. "Sarah!" Mrs. Rodriguez appeared beside her, carrying a clipboard and looking slightly frazzled. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "Good nervous or bad nervous?" Sarah thought about this. "Both, I think," Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. "That's exactly how you should feel. It means you care about doing well, but you're also ready to take a risk. Remember what you discovered the other day. Trust your instincts." The students were led backstage to a classroom that was serving as a waiting area. Sarah looked around at her fellow performers. Some of them looked calm and confident. Others looked as nervous as she felt. Jessica was doing warm-up exercises with her fingers, running through scales and arpeggios. Tommy was humming his piece quietly to himself. Mrs. Rodriguez gathered everyone together for a final pep talk. "I want you all to remember why we're here tonight," she said. "This isn't a competition. This isn't about proving who's the best musician. This is about sharing the joy of music with the people who care about you. Your families and friends are here because they want to support you and hear the beautiful music you've been working so hard to learn." She looked around at each student individually. "I'm proud of every single one of you, regardless of how tonight goes. You've all grown so much as musicians this year, and that growth doesn't depend on whether you hit every note perfectly tonight." At 6:45, Mrs. Rodriguez started calling students back to the stage area for final preparations. The recital would begin with the youngest students and work up to the most advanced. Sarah was scheduled to perform 8th out of 15 students, which meant she would be somewhere in the middle of the program. From backstage, Sarah could hear the murmur of voices as the audience filled the auditorium. She peeked through a gap in the curtains and saw her parents and Jake sitting in the third row. Her mom was holding a small bouquet of flowers, and her dad had his phone ready to record the performance. The sight of her family made Sarah feel both better and worse. Better because she could see how much they wanted to support her. Worse because she didn't want to disappoint them. The recital began with a tiny first grader playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with one finger. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and Sarah felt some of her tension ease. This was supposed to be fun, she reminded herself. This was supposed to be about sharing music, not about being judged. The performances continued with students of various ages and skill levels. Some played classical pieces, others played popular songs or folk tunes. Each performance was met with warm applause and encouragement from the audience. Sarah watched from the side of the stage as her classmates performed their recital pieces. Jessica's Moonlight Sonata was indeed impressive, though Sarah noticed she rushed through some of the more difficult sections. Tommy played his Chopin piece beautifully, with excellent technique and clear articulation. As each student finished their performance, Sarah felt her own nervousness growing. Soon it would be her turn to walk out onto that stage and sit down. At the grand piano, Sarah Chun, Mrs. Rodriguez called softly, "You're up next." Sarah's heart started pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She smoothed down her dress, a simple blue one that her mom had helped her pick out specifically for tonight. She had wanted to wear something that made her feel confident, but not overdressed. She walked to the edge of the stage and waited for the student before her to finish. Marcus was playing his Rachmaninoff prelude, and it sounded even more impressive in performance than it had during practice. The complex harmonies and virtuosic passages filled the auditorium with rich, dramatic music. When Marcus finished, the audience erupted in enthusiastic applause. He took a bow and walked off stage, passing Sarah with a smile and a whispered, "Good luck." Mrs. Rodriguez walked out onto the stage to introduce Sarah. "Our next performer is Sarah Chun, who will be playing Für Elisa by Ludwig van Beethoven." Sarah heard her name and felt her legs turn to jelly. This was it. There was no backing out now. She took a deep breath and walked out onto the stage. The spotlight was brighter than she had expected, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience at all. She could hear them, though. The polite rustling as people settled in their seats, a few scattered coughs, and underneath it all, a sense of expectant attention. She walked to the piano and adjusted the bench to the right height. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the keys. She looked down at the keyboard and tried to remember everything she had learned about this piece over the past 6 weeks. The simple notes of the written arrangement, the beautiful embellishments she had discovered during that magical practice session 3 days ago. Mrs. Rodriguez's encouragement to trust her instincts. Jake's advice to focus on making music rather than impressing people. Sarah took one more deep breath and placed her fingers on the keys. The auditorium fell completely silent. This was the moment of truth. Sarah's fingers touched the keys, and the opening notes of Für Elise floated out into the silent auditorium. At first she played exactly as written, just like she had practiced for weeks. Her right hand picked out the famous melody while her left hand provided simple accompaniment. The notes were correct, but they felt mechanical and lifeless. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her. In the front rows, she could make out the faces of her classmates who had already performed. Some looked encouraging, others seemed distracted. She thought she saw Jessica whispering something to the girl next to her, and Sarah's concentration wavered for a moment. Sarah considered just getting through the piece as safely as possible. Play it exactly as written, don't take any risks, and get off the stage without embarrassing herself. That had been her original plan, after all. But then something shifted. Maybe it was the beautiful tone of the grand piano, so much richer than anything she had practiced on at home. Maybe it was remembering how magical it had felt to discover her own musical voice 3 days ago. Or maybe it was simply that the music itself was too beautiful to play without feeling. As she moved into the second phrase of the melody, Sarah felt her left hand beginning to do something different. Almost without conscious thought, her pinky finger reached down to add a deeper bass note that wasn't written in her simple arrangement. The sound it created was fuller and more resonant, giving the melody a stronger foundation. The audience probably didn't notice the small change, but Sarah felt it immediately. It was like a door opening in her mind. If she could trust herself to add that one note, maybe she could trust herself to do more. As she continued playing, more changes began happening naturally. Her left hand started adding the subtle harmonies she had discovered during that practice session in the empty auditorium. These weren't random notes, they were musical ideas that her ear told her would enhance the melody. Each addition made the simple arrangement sound more complete and sophisticated. Her right hand began adding small embellishments too. Nothing flashy or showy, just tiny decorative notes that made the familiar melody more interesting. She found herself slightly altering the rhythm in some places, adding little pauses that created dramatic tension before resolving back to the main theme. Most importantly, her dynamics started changing. Sarah had spent weeks playing the piece at basically the same volume level all the way through. But now, she found herself playing some phrases very softly, creating an intimate feeling that made people lean forward to listen. Other sections she played with more strength and confidence, letting the full power of the grand piano ring through the auditorium. The transformation wasn't happening all at once. It was gradual, like slowly turning up the brightness on a light. With each phrase, Sarah became more confident about trusting her musical instincts. With each embellishment, she felt more connected to the music itself rather than just the notes on the page. About halfway through the piece, Sarah realized something amazing was happening. She was no longer thinking about the audience or worrying about making mistakes. She wasn't even thinking about the notes she was supposed to play next. Instead, she was completely absorbed in the music itself, letting it flow through her hands and out into the auditorium. This was what Mrs. Rodriguez had meant when she talked about making music rather than just playing notes. Sarah was having a conversation with Beethoven's melody, adding her own voice to something that had been written over 200 years ago. She was making the music her own while still respecting the composer's original intentions. The audience, which had started out politely attentive, was becoming genuinely engaged. Sarah couldn't see individual faces because of the stage lights, but she could feel the change in their attention. The restless shifting and quiet conversations had stopped. The entire auditorium seemed to be focused on what she was doing at the piano. Parents who had been checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors were now sitting still and listening. Other students who had been thinking about their own upcoming performances were drawn into Sarah's interpretation of this familiar piece. Even Mrs. Rodriguez, who had heard Fur Elise performed by students countless times over the years, was struck by what Sarah was doing with it. This wasn't just a competent performance of a simple arrangement. This was real musicianship, real interpretation, real artistic expression. Sarah reached the most dramatic section of the piece, where the melody becomes more intense and passionate. In her simple arrangement, this section was still relatively easy to play, but Sarah found ways to make it emotionally powerful without adding technical difficulty. She used stronger dynamics, more expressive phrasing, and subtle changes in tempo to create the sense of drama that this music demanded. Her left hand provided a solid foundation with deep bass notes and rich harmonies. Her right hand sang out the melody with confidence and feeling. For these few measures, the simple student arrangement sounded like it could have been a professional performance. As she moved toward the final section of the piece, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of rushing toward the ending like she had sometimes done in practice, she slowed down. She let each note of the concluding melody have its full value. She played the final phrases with a sense of gentle resolution, as if she was reluctantly saying goodbye to something beautiful. The last notes hung in the air for a moment before fading into silence. Sarah kept her hands on the keys, not quite ready to break the spell that had been created. She had never experienced anything like what had just happened. She had started out playing a simple student arrangement, but somewhere along the way, she had discovered that she was capable of making real music. The silence in the auditorium stretched on for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Sarah finally lifted her hands from the keys. and looked out at the audience for the first time since she had started playing. What she saw amazed her. Hundreds of faces looking back at her with expressions of surprise, appreciation, and genuine enjoyment. These people hadn't just politely tolerated her performance. They had actually been moved by it. But the most amazing thing was still to come. As Sarah continued playing through the final section of Für Elise, something extraordinary was happening both to her and to everyone listening. What had started as a nervous student trying to get through a simple piece had become something much more powerful and moving. Sarah herself was experiencing a complete transformation. All the weeks of worry about not being good enough, all the anxiety about playing an easy piece, all the fear about embarrassing herself in front of an audience had melted away completely. She was no longer Sarah, the beginner pianist, struggling to keep up with more advanced students. She had become Sarah the musician, someone who could take a piece of music and make it speak with her own voice. The change had happened gradually, but now it was complete. Her posture at the piano was more confident. Her hands moved with authority and grace. Most importantly, her connection to the music was total. She wasn't just playing notes anymore. She was telling a story. The story she was telling through Beethoven's melody was deeply personal. It was about feeling inadequate and finding your own strength. It was about being afraid to take risks and then discovering that risks can lead to beautiful things. It was about the journey from self-doubt to self-acceptance, from playing it safe to trusting your own instincts, but the audience didn't need to know the details of Sarah's personal story to be moved by her playing. Music has a way of communicating emotions directly, without needing words or explanations. What came through in Sarah's performance was authenticity, vulnerability, and courage. People could hear that this young musician was sharing something real and important with them. In the third row, Sarah's parents were experiencing their own transformation. They had come to the recital expecting to be proud and supportive, but also somewhat worried about how their daughter would handle the pressure of performing. What they were witnessing instead was the emergence of a genuine artist. Sarah's mother felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the beautiful phrasing and expressive dynamics her daughter was creating. This wasn't the mechanical practice she had been hearing from the living room for weeks. This was music making at its most fundamental level. Jake, sitting next to his parents, was amazed by what his sister was accomplishing. He knew how nervous and doubtful she had been about this performance. He had watched her struggle with feelings of inadequacy compared to the other students. But what he was hearing now was playing that was more musical and emotionally engaging than many of the more technically difficult pieces that had been performed earlier in the evening. Throughout the auditorium, people were having similar reactions. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had hoped that Sarah would find some confidence and enjoyment in her performance, was witnessing something beyond her expectations. This student, who had been so worried about not being advanced enough for the recital, was giving one of the most genuinely musical performances of the entire evening. Other parents, who had initially been focused mainly on their own children's upcoming performances, found themselves drawn into Sarah's interpretation of this familiar piece. Many of them knew Für Elise well, either from their own childhood piano lessons or from hearing it performed countless times over the years. But they had never heard it played with quite this combination of simplicity and sophistication. Sarah's fellow students were experiencing a range of emotions as they listened. Some felt inspired by what she was accomplishing with such a seemingly basic arrangement. If Sarah could make a simple piece sound this beautiful and moving, what possibilities existed for their own musical development? Others felt a touch of envy, not because Sarah's piece was more difficult than theirs, but because her performance had a quality of genuine expression that some of their more technically impressive performances had lacked. They were beginning to understand that musical success isn't just about playing difficult pieces correctly, but about connecting with the music in a personal and authentic way. As Sarah played through the final phrases of the piece, she made some choices that surprised even her. Instead of simply playing the written ending, she allowed herself to add a few extra repetitions of the main theme, each one softer and more delicate than the last. It was as if she didn't want to let go of the beautiful musical moment she had created. She had never planned these additions during her practice sessions. They were happening spontaneously, guided by her musical instincts and her sense of what the piece needed in this particular moment, in this particular space, for this particular audience. Her final phrase was played so softly that the auditorium had become completely silent, with everyone straining to hear every note. She let the last chord ring for a long time, using the sustain pedal to let the sound gradually fade away naturally. When the final note disappeared into silence, Sarah kept her hands poised above the keys for just a moment longer. She could hardly believe what had just happened. She had started this performance feeling terrified and inadequate. She was ending it feeling like she had discovered something important about herself as a musician and as a person. The silence that followed wasn't the polite pause that typically occurs after a student performance while people prepare to clap. This was the kind of profound silence that follows something truly special, when an audience needs a moment to process what they have just experienced. Sarah finally lifted her hands from the piano and turned slightly toward the audience. For the first time since she had started playing, she was fully aware of the hundreds of people watching her. But instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, she felt proud and accomplished. She could see faces in the audience more clearly now, and what she saw filled her with amazement. People weren't just being polite or supportive. They looked genuinely moved by what they had heard. Some had expressions of surprise, as if they hadn't expected to be so affected by a student performance. Others looked thoughtful and reflective, as if the music had reminded them of something important in their own lives. Sarah started to stand up from the piano bench, preparing to take her bow and leave the stage. She expected the usual burst of polite applause that had followed each performance so far that evening. What happened instead changed everything. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, the auditorium remained in complete silence. Sarah stood beside the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly from the intensity of what she had just experienced. She looked out at the sea of faces, uncertain what to expect. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, came the sound of one person clapping. The applause was slow and deliberate, the kind of clapping that comes from someone who has been genuinely moved by what they've heard. Within seconds, other hands joined in, and then more, and then suddenly the entire auditorium erupted into the most enthusiastic applause Sarah had ever heard. But this wasn't just polite applause. This wasn't the kind of supportive clapping that parents give to encourage young performers. This was the real thing. This was the sound of an audience that had been truly impressed, truly moved, truly touched by what they had just experienced. Sarah stood frozen in amazement as the applause grew louder and more intense. People weren't just clapping, they were clapping with real enthusiasm and energy. She could hear individual voices calling out, "Bravo!" and "Beautiful!" from different parts of the auditorium. Then something even more incredible happened. In the third row, Sarah's father stood up, still clapping vigorously. Her mother followed immediately, rising to her feet with tears streaming down her face. Jake jumped up next to them, grinning widely as he applauded his sister's performance. Like a wave spreading through the auditorium, more and more people began standing. First the rows near Sarah's family, then the sections behind them, then the entire back half of the auditorium. Within 30 seconds, every single person in the audience was on their feet, giving Sarah a standing ovation. Sarah had never experienced anything like this. She had seen standing ovations at professional concerts, but she never imagined that she, a 16-year-old student who had been taking piano lessons for only 2 years, could inspire this kind of response from an audience. The applause seemed to go on forever. Just when Sarah thought it might be starting to die down, it would surge again, as if people didn't want to stop expressing their appreciation for what they had heard. She could see Mrs. Rodriguez in the wings, clapping enthusiastically with a huge smile on her face and tears in her eyes. Sarah attempted to take a bow, but the applause only grew louder. She bowed again, deeper this time, and gestured toward the piano as if to thank the instrument itself for being part of this magical experience. The audience loved this gesture and responded with even more enthusiastic clapping. As she stood there accepting this overwhelming response, Sarah felt a profound shift in how she saw herself. For weeks, she had defined herself by what she couldn't do. She couldn't play as well as the other students. She couldn't handle difficult pieces. She couldn't be a real musician because she was too new, too inexperienced, too ordinary. But the response of this audience was telling her something completely different. They weren't applauding her in spite of playing a simple piece. They weren't being kind to a struggling beginner. They were celebrating genuine musical achievement, authentic artistic expression, and the kind of performance that touches people's hearts. In that moment, Sarah understood what Mrs. Rodriguez had been trying to tell her all along. Music isn't about showing off technical skills or impressing people with how difficult your repertoire is. Music is about communication. It's about taking something beautiful and sharing it with others in a way that moves them, that makes them feel something, that reminds them why music matters. Sarah had done exactly that. She had taken Beethoven's simple, beautiful melody and shared it with authenticity, sensitivity, and genuine musical understanding. The fact that her arrangement was technically simple didn't matter at all. What mattered was that she had made it meaningful. As the applause finally began to subside, Sarah took one final bow and walked off the stage. Her legs felt shaky, but this time it wasn't from nerves. It was from the overwhelming realization of what she had just accomplished. Mrs. Rodriguez met her in the wings with a huge hug. That was absolutely incredible, Sarah. I have never been more proud of a student's performance. I can't believe that just happened, Sarah said, still in a daze. I can't believe they responded like that. You gave them something beautiful and real, Mrs. Rodriguez said. That's what great performances do. They connect with people on an emotional level, and that's exactly what you did tonight. The rest of the recital continued, but Sarah barely heard the remaining performances. She was still processing what had happened to her on that stage. She had discovered something about herself that she never knew existed. She wasn't just someone who took piano lessons. She was a musician. She had the ability to move people with music, to create moments of beauty and meaning through her playing. After the recital ended, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her. Fellow students who had seemed so much more advanced than her were telling her how beautiful her performance had been. Parents she didn't even know were stopping to say how much they had enjoyed her playing. That was amazing, Jessica said, and Sarah could tell she really meant it. I've never heard Für Elise played like that before. It was so musical. Tommy nodded in agreement. You made it sound like a completely different piece. It was really cool how you added all those extra things. On the drive home, Sarah's family couldn't stop talking about the performance. I knew you had been practicing hard, her mother said, but I had no idea you had developed that level of musical maturity. That was truly artistic playing. I'm so proud of you, her father added. Not just for playing well, but for having the courage to trust yourself and take risks up there. Jake, sitting next to Sarah in the back seat, was grinning at her. You totally proved that it doesn't matter how simple or complicated a piece is. It's all about how you play it. As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah realized that this experience had changed her relationship with music forever. She was no longer afraid of not being good enough or advanced enough. She had learned that musical ability isn't just about technical skill. It's about having something to say and the courage to say it. She had also learned that sometimes the most powerful performances come not from showing off what you can do, but from sharing who you are. Her simple arrangement of Für Elise had been the perfect vehicle for expressing her own musical voice because it gave her space to add her own ideas while staying true to the beauty of Beethoven's original composition. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered that she didn't need to be like anyone else to be a successful musician. She didn't need to play the same pieces as other students or develop the same technical abilities. She just needed to be authentic, to trust her instincts, and to remember that music is about sharing beauty and emotion with others. As she got ready for bed that night, Sarah could still hear the echo of that thunderous applause in her mind. But more than the applause, she remembered the feeling of being completely connected to the music, of making something beautiful happen through her own hands and heart. She had walked onto that stage as Sarah the nervous beginner. She had walked off as Sarah the musician. And that transformation, she knew, would last for the rest of her life.